אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו במלחמה. לא במבצע, לא בסבבים, במלחמה. הבוקר חמאס פתח במתקפת פתע רצחני נגד מדינת ישראל ונגד אזרחיה. אנחנו בתוך זה משעות הבוקר המוקדמות. כינסתי את ראשי מערכת הביטחון. הנחיתי קודם כל לטהר את היישובים מהמחבלים שחדרו פנימה. הפעולה הזאת מתבצעת בשעות הללו. במקביל הוריתי לבצע גיוס מילואים נרחב ולהשיב מלחמה שערה בעוצמה ובהיקף שהאויב לא הכיר. האויב ישלם מחיר שהוא לא ידע מותו. אני קורא בינתיים לכל אזרחי ישראל להישמע בקפדנות להנחיות הצבא, להנחיות פיקוד העורף. אנחנו במלחמה ואנחנו ננצח בה.
Israel at war. The latest updates regarding what is happening on the ground in Israel and what is happening elsewhere outside its borders is just as equally as important. And already we have seen declarations of war coming from the conservative and democratic parties. Again, just like in yesterday's video, this is not surprising since there is a bilateral agreement across the board, sweeping agreement that Israel should use whatever force necessary, even if it's against international law, as we saw with posts coming from Nikki Haley and Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro. All these very right-wing conservative talking heads are basically pushing. These are Zionists, by the way, evangelical Christian Zionists, same thing. They are pushing for an all-out war, even at the behest of Palestinian lives, in response to the brutal attacks by Hamas. And we're going to read the latest news. This is Associated Press earlier today. Israel declares war, bombards Gaza as fighting rages for second day after Hamas attack. The Israeli government formally declared war Sunday and gave the green light for significant military steps to retaliate against Hamas for its surprise attack as the military tried to crush fighters still in southern towns and intensified its bombardment of the Gaza Strip. The toll passed 1,100 dead and thousands wounded on both sides. More than 24 hours after Hamas launched its unprecedented incursion out of Gaza, Israeli forces were still battling the militants holed up in several locations Monday morning. At least 700 people have reportedly been killed in Israel, a staggering toll on a scale the country has not experienced in decades, and more than 400 have been killed in Gaza. Israel said it brought in special forces to try to wrest control of 4 sites from Hamas fighters, including 2 kibbutzim that militants entered earlier in their attacks. The declaration of war portended greater fighting ahead, and a major question was whether Israel would launch a ground assault into Gaza, a move that in the past has brought intensified casualties. And that's not all. According to Politico, Biden plans to send additional aid to Israel on top of the aid we already give them. The Biden administration is working to fulfill Israel's request to urgently transfer weapons to Tel Aviv from Ukraine, by the way. Of course, we're still giving weapons to Ukraine, but that's about to change. And as I said yesterday, with the new conflict now, this will be a slow dissolution from Ukraine to Israel because the next conflict is Iran. You bet your bottom dollar, and I'm going to be right on that. According to U.S. officials and second person familiar with the talks, a day after Hamas militants launched an unprecedented wave of attacks on southern Israel, a conflict that threatens to erupt into wider war. That's going to be right. Israeli officials have asked the United States to transfer specific weapon systems, said the people who were granted anonymity to speak ahead of any announcement in Washington is working to make that happen. They did not say what those weapons were, citing operational security. That's, fine. But what I'm about to read next is, just goes to show you the levels the United States are willing to go in regards to taking advantage of a situation. And, you'll see soon, the weapons transfer could be part of a new package of assistance for Israel, which Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CNN Sunday morning, quote, "We are looking at specific additional requests that the Israelis have made. I think you're likely to hear more about that later today," end quote, Blinken told CNN. Any request for additional aid for Israel will immediately run headlong into the dysfunction enveloping the House, which would need to approve extra funding, and they'll get it. As former Speaker Kevin McCarthy noted on Saturday, quote, "There is nothing the House can do until elect a speaker, and I don't know if that happens quickly," end quote. Now, let's read what France Joint Forces, Iran's Raisi backs Palestinian self-defense. You know what? But before I get to that, this is the greater picture I was talking about yesterday. And this is coming straight from the U.S. Department of Defense. This is really important because usually with terrorist incidents, and I'm a 9/11 investigator, and I could tell you from my own experience, I'm not an expert, I'm just an investigator. From my own experience, every act of terrorism, especially when it's Arab fundamentalism, and in this case, the greater goal is not to take out the Arab extremists. That's part of it. You got to look at the bigger scope here. Now, what's the bigger scope? The bigger picture here, right? The bigger picture here is, what does this mean in the greater context of the Middle East, in Persia, in Southeast Asia, right? What this means is that it's not a war against Hamas necessarily. It's a war against Iran. It's a war, by extension, a war against Syria and Lebanon, because this is just as much as a sectarian war. This is basically a war about geopolitics and a war of religion. If you look at it from the side of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, this is the elimination of a centuries-long enemy, Shia Islam. Shias compromised a majority in Iran, they compromised a minority in Syria, and they compromised a majority in Lebanon. But the biggest percentage of Shias in the world are on Iran. And the Wahhabis, which constitute a percentage in Saudi Arabia, which actually the ideology makes half of the country, don't go by modernization. I'm not buying that for a second. That's just to appease the masters in the West. All right. When you look at this picture, you can see why Saudi Arabia is basically scaling back and not really calling for peace. Now, yeah, they'll say it on the paper, but they're not pushing for it. Now, when you look at it from the geopolitical context of Israel, for example, they're taking out their most formidable preconceived enemy, which has been Iran for decades. Why? Because Iran is funding Hamas. They fund the Palestinian jihad. Now, the ghouls in Iran, the mullahs, I don't support. But you bet your bottom dollar, I am going to support the people in Iran. I would rather be allied to them than Saudi Arabia. If you're looking at, a true hegemony in the region, it has to start with them. It's not going to start with Israel. It's not going to start with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Incidentally, these are our allies. That's the government's allies, not my ally. My ally is with the people of the world. And, no matter what the conservatives say or what the warmongers of the Democrats will say, they don't represent the people. They never have. And the majority of people are suckers for the truth. And they don't want war. And when you look at it from the Israeli and Saudi perspective, you wonder why this engagement heightened to what it is today. Now, take a look at what the statement from Secretary Lloyd Austin said, and you'll see whose side the United States is on. Unequivocally, it's Israel. But they're not just going to war with Hamas. This statement by Lloyd Austin, here it is. My thoughts continue to be with the people of Israel. Not once is he saying Palestinians. He didn't make this statement when the Palestinians were being subjected to brutalization for the past couple of 70 years, say, for example, or just recently about what was going on with Israeli settler violence that was backed by the police. that was kept quiet by the Shin Bet, the domestic arm of Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces basically allowed the settlers to commit acts of violence on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, burn Palestinian crops, shoot a 19-year-old on a rooftop, while the IDF commits assassinations on Palestinian protesters. All this was basically not given any attention. Today, in response to the Hamas attack on Israel and following detailed discussions with President Biden, I have directed several steps to strengthen the Department of Defense posture in the region to bolster regional deterrence efforts. And these next few sentences are really important. This leads to the greater geopolitical view of what's going to happen in the next few weeks and months. I have directed the movement of the USS Gerald Ford Strike Group carrier to the Eastern Mediterranean. This includes the U.S. Navy carrier USS Gerald Ford, the CVN-78, the Tinder Gorgoa glass-guided missile cruiser of the USS Normandy, as well as the Arleigh Bunker-class guided missile destroyer of the USS Thomas Hudner, USS Ramage, the USS Carney, and the USS Roosevelt. We have also taken steps to augment U.S. Air Force, FS-35s, FS-15s, FS-16s, and A-10 fighter aircraft squadrons in the region. The U.S. maintains ready force globally to further reinforce this deterrence posture if required. In addition, the United States government will be rapidly providing the Israeli Defense Forces with additional equipment and resources, including munitions. The first security assistance will begin moving today and arriving in the coming days. Strengthening our joint force posture, in addition to the material support that we will rapidly provide to Israel, underscores the United States' ironclad support for the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli people. My team and I will continue to be in close contact with our Israeli counterparts to ensure that they have what they need to protect their citizens and defend themselves against these heinous terrorist attacks. The hypocrisy of the United States government is astounding. Now, I want to make one thing certainly clear here. This is not a video, just like yesterday's video. It's not a video defending what Hamas did. As I said, violence begets violence. I'm for the absolute elimination, not partial removal, not calling for peace with Hamas. I'm calling for the elimination of Hamas in general, as well as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Complete elimination. Kill them all. All right? Now, with that being said, the brutal occupation, military occupation of the Palestinian people, because that's who's going to suffer here too. And Hamas doesn't care about Palestinians. Just like Al-Qaeda doesn't care about Muslims. You know, similar to these attacks, when Al-Qaeda attacked the United States using the planes operation, what a lot of people don't know is that there was a rift within Al-Qaeda. Part of them said that this idea by bin Laden to hijack planes and crash them in the United States would bring about the full force of the U.S. government on them. And Al-Qaeda, a religious committee called the Shura Council, disagreed with bin Laden. There was a couple of even ranking military commanders that disagreed with bin Laden. Very few in Al-Qaeda agreed to this or even knew about this. That's for one. Two, bin Laden basically invited his own doom, as well as the Muslims, by doing this. Do you think he cared? Do you think he cared about the plight of Muslims? He's not a Muslim. He's a kafir. He's munafiq. He's not a kafir. He's a munafiq. That's Arabic for an Arab who is a Muslim who's a fake Muslim. He's not an actual pious Muslim. Kafir is a non-believer. That's what bin Laden is. That's what Al-Qaeda is. That's what Hamas is. And Hamas, if they played the long run, but they're reactionaries, much like all terrorist groups and fundamentalist groups, especially from a right-wing political perspective. They're reactionaries. Leftist socialist groups like Antifa, or groups like in California, By Any Means Necessary, these small leftist groups, they're reactionaries. They don't think about the long run. They don't care about the plight of the people. Hamas doesn't care about Palestinians, but at the same time, the Israeli government are going to use this to subjugate and destroy Gaza, which is what they always wanted to do. But they couldn't outright do it because the world would be condemning them. Now you got the approval of the conservatives who are basically saying, do it. Nikki Haley actually tweeted a couple of times saying, destroy of Gaza, end it. She tweeted, end it. That's what she wrote. And I mean, I'll even show you the absurdity of people like Nikki Haley. Don't take my word for it here. This is not just an attack on Israel. This was an attack on America. How? Finish them, Netanyahu. What does that mean? Destroy them. Palestinians. They should have hell to pay for what they have just done. She didn't say anything about the brutal occupation from the Israeli government using the IDF, using its military to subjugate Palestinians for the last 70 years. No, you didn't hear it from Nikki Haley, and you didn't hear it from conservatives all throughout the decades. And as I tweeted earlier today, if the last 36 hours have been quite brutal for you, and you have dissenting opinions, and you're outraged over what happened to Israel for 36 hours, you haven't been paying attention for the last 70 years. Or you have selected outrage, and I'll say you have crocodile tears. You don't really care about what's going on there. You're using it to justify your biased moral outrage. And what this means for the longer picture, especially for you conservatives who are suddenly anti-war with Ukraine, but now you're bloodthirsty revenge when it comes to Israel, because you're hypocrites. You see an opening for a window and you're not even getting your leg out, you're diving out the window. Because now this is your justification, because evangelical Christians are Zionists by definition. You're nationalists. That's what Zionists are. That's what Israeli Zionists are. They're nationalists, racists. And that gives justification for every prime minister in Israel, going all the way back to its founder, to the tenants of Theodore Herzl, to the prime ministers like Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon, and presidents like them, and Benjamin Netanyahu, Ehud Olmert. The list is long about the war crimes that they have committed. And I'm shocked that it took up until yesterday to finally, see a widespread reaction. Unfortunately, it came from Hamas, because now it gives them, it gives Israel the justification to basically level Gaza and destroy Palestinians by overreacting, without getting world condemnation for it. There were people from the United Nations Security Council supporting Israel and supporting their reaction. Need I even mention, Josh Hawley, Nikki Haley, Ben Shapiro, Jim Jordan, even Jordan Peterson. I'm not going to call you a doctor either. You lost that title with your biased support for a brutal occupier and ignoring the plight of the poor people in Palestine. None of you people, you hypocrites, had the audacity to speak out against Israeli travesties, government and military travesties, and you act outrage about what happened in response. Look what these did. They're animals, these people, and yet you have the unmitigated nerve to actually complain about the response for what you got. Now, does this mean that what Hamas did was justified? No, but I can see why they did it. Hamas didn't wake up one day and say, I'm just going to attack Israel for its policies. This was a buildup of decades of oppression, decades of murder, decades of imprisonment. You talk about the rape of Israeli women citizens, as disgustingly tragic that is. And that's who the real tragedy lies, with innocent Israeli citizens who are being maimed, marginalized, and killed, just as the Palestinian women, men, and children who have been brutalized for decades. And none of you conservatives said nothing in response. I don't see Secretary of State Antony Blinken or Secretary of the Secretary of the Army basically sending ships in defense of Palestinians. I don't see them sending Air Force munitions in defense for the Gaza Strip and for the West Bank. Only when it's the terrorists, the Arab fundamentalists, and you use that justification to brutalize what? The broader picture. Oh, Iran is connected to Hamas. We need to go to war with Iran. How close are we? Well, why don't we go back to the article I was going to talk about just before? Iran's Raisi backs Palestinian self-defense, warns Israel. Palestinian militants from the Iran-backed Islamist group Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, penetrated Israel at dawn on Saturday under the cover of a massive rocket barrage. Almost 1,000 people have been killed in the conflict so far, with Israel reporting more than 600 lives lost and Gaza's health ministry putting the toll at 370 dead. The Zionist regime, Israel, and its supporters are responsible for endangering the security of nations in the region, and they must be held accountable in that matter. Iran supports the legitimate defense of that Palestinian nation, Raisi said, quoted by state television. There's nothing wrong with that statement. What Iran should do next is basically eliminate support for Hamas and condemn Hamas for what they've done. He urged Muslim governments to support the Palestinian nation while praising resistance fighters by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, as well as in countries including Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Raisi had spoken earlier with leaders of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad officials, the media said. State news agency IRNA said he had discussed the developments in Palestine in separate phone calls with Islamic Jihad Secretary Ziad al-Naqada and Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh. And why I think Iran is making a mistake here, because the United States and Israel are going to justify this, say this was a coordinated attack backed by Iran, and we need to go to war. And that just, I think Iran probably sees the writing on the wall and says, we're going to go all in. We might as well. Because that's what Hamas is doing here. They're all in. It's either this or it's death. At the behest of Palestinian and Israeli lives. Now, I'm probably going to be making, updated videos probably every day for the next couple of weeks, because the story is getting worse and worse by the hour. The news coming out of Lebanon is that Hezbollah has fired rocket attacks near West Bank, but not extending past it. And that basically shows Hezbollah's support for Hamas to an extent. They're not going all-out war. I think what Lebanon and Syria and Iran are going to do, they're going to wait and see how far this has gone. And they're not waiting on Hamas. They're waiting on Israel. They're waiting on to see how much of an attack they're going to force on Gaza. And if there is an all-out assault on Gaza, as I think there's going to be in the next couple of days, you'll see an escalation in the violence from Hezbollah. And with that comes the reaction from the U.S. military, because those ships, those air carriers, they're not for Hamas. They're for Iran. They're for Syria. They're for Lebanon. Hamas is not a standing military. They have homemade rockets. They stole tanks from the Israeli military. Those military-grade weapons are for the Persians, are for the Alawites. Just like with 9/11. Did we go to war with Saudi Arabia, who funded the attacks, where most of the hijackers were from? No. We went to war with two, Iraq, who had nothing to do with 9/11. We went to war with Syria. We went to war with Libya. And in some cases, we actually funded the al-Qaeda affiliates in Libya and Syria. That's not a speculation. That's not a conspiracy theory, outrageous conspiracy theory. That's the Operation Timber Sycamore. So we can overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Those ships are not for Hamas. They're for Hezbollah, they're for Iran, they're for Lebanon and Syria, and for anyone else who wants to intervene. That's why we went to war with Syria, so we could break that connection between Iran to Lebanon, which was supported by the Gulf and Israel. Just take a look at the proxy wars in Syria and how we assisted al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria, how we allowed for the Libya to be destroyed. Utterly, now it's a sectarian wasteland. Thank you, Hillary Clinton. These wars that were supported by Israel, they housed al-Qaeda affiliates in the Golan Heights. Regarding the Syria conflict, this goes to show you the hypocrisy of governments. Cooler heads need to prevail. And I don't see anyone from the Democrat or Republican parties. Maybe I saw one in particular that said cooler heads need to prevail. Just like with Afghanistan, Barbara Lee was the only dissenting voice. I think it was like 330 votes to 1. And Barbara Lee was proven right. And what happened? Taliban wasn't destroyed in Afghanistan. In fact, it's stronger now than it ever has been. A 20-year war for nothing. American lives at the cost for nothing. Iraq was a losing war. 1 million killed. How many more are going to die in this war that I see down the road with Iran? It'll be worse than anything regarding Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. It'll be combined because Iran has a standing military, has a good naval military. And it's going to take more than the United States and Israel. Israel won't be participating. They'll watch, just like they did with any war the United States was in. They used the United States and coalition partners to act on their behalf because they can't fight. They instigate battles. They instigate wars. It's not anti-Semitic to say so. Just look at history. When you are led by a brutal government and you oppress the people, don't be surprised when the people fight back. And for those who are outraged about what the groups like Hamas did, would you be outraged at the founding fathers? Would you be outraged at the French who fought back and the American farmers who fought back against the British colonialists for their fight against the British Empire? Yes, you would. You would consider the French and those farmers terrorists at the same premise because they dared fight back against an empire. They fought back against a colonizer, a brutal government. Cooler heads need to prevail. The people need to speak out. We saw some protests here in New York. I think we saw a protest in, if I'm correct, in Detroit. I don't know elsewhere. I just got back from home from the gym, so I'm still updating, still reading about certain things, but I've seen protests. We need more, and we need them to be consistent, because the anti-war voice, and believe me, there's anti-war protesters, you hippies are out there. This is your chance. Just like with Iraq war, we had the largest protest. We haven't seen protests like that ever. People tend to forget that in 2003, before we went to the invasion of Iraq, which was supported by the United Nations Security Council, we saw protests all around the world. We need to see that again. Because if we do not, in the next 12 months, I'm going to strongly predict, with strong convictions, we will go to war with Iran. And this will be a prophecy. If next year we have Governor DeSantis as the president of the United States, because he's an AIPAC supporter, and they'll support the next war and phase out from Ukraine. They're already doing that. And so, like I said, cooler heads need to prevail. The people need to speak out. And as usual, I will always report the latest news without bias and without prejudice, because that's what the people deserve. All right, guys. See you in the next video. Take care. Have a good night.